Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Before we dive in, just a little bit of an intro to who we are. We are a center based out of the University of Pittsburgh, and we're funded by grants from the Administration for Community Living and the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Our mission is to partner with government, academia, and the family caregiver community to transform research into services and programs. Our goal is to improve the care, the health, and the quality of life of people with disabilities and the families that support them. So today, as you all know, we are covering a very important and timely topic, which is special education during remote learning. We are very lucky to be joined by Cindy Dutch, the Director of Parent Advising from the PEAL Center, who I will be introducing in just a moment. But to get the logistical things out of the way, we welcome questions. You can submit them during the presentation or at the end, whatever you feel most comfortable with. There is an option for Q&A and for chat. You should see them down at the bottom of your screen. You can choose either one and they will get to us. Or if you feel more comfortable speaking out loud, under the participant tab at the bottom, there's an option to raise your hand. And if you do that, I will see it and I'm able to unmute you so that you can ask your question. At the end of the webinar today, it will be recorded, so we will send this out to anyone who registered. Just give us a day or two to get it all together, but you will be receiving a recording, and we will also send out a questionnaire that we ask that you fill out to help us better serve you with webinars in the future. So, to introduce Cindy Dutch, who you should be able to see now, she is the Director of Parent Advising for the PEAL Center. Her career in advocacy began when her first son was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. And in addition to her work at the PEAL Center, Cindy is the former chairperson for the local task force for the rights of education in Allegheny County and is currently a member. She believes that the local task force is one of the greatest hidden resources for parents of children with disabilities in the public school system. She also serves the disability community as the co-chairperson of the Western Pennsylvania Coalition of Education Advocates and as a peer monitor assisting the PA Department of Education in monitoring the special education departments of school districts in Pennsylvania. So we are very lucky and grateful to have her with us today to present to you. So with that, I'm going to let her take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Heather. I'm so glad to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about the PEAL Center. PEAL, Parent Education Advocacy Leadership, is the Parent Training and Information Center for Pennsylvania. Under IDEA, every state is mandated to have at least one Parent Training and Information Center that is funded by the Federal Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, to help families understand their rights, to help them strategize for meetings, to help them understand what dispute resolution options they have, and to ensure that children are educated in their least restrictive environment. So in slide 2, I'm going to give you our objectives for today. Just keep in mind, we're we're going to stay away from some personal issues. If you have personal questions about an individual or some issues that you're having, feel free to call the PEAL Center, forward some information to Heather. She can, let me know about it, and we can talk more in depth about those. We're going to start by listing and defining key principles of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're going to identify the parts of the individual education program and the importance of each one, and discuss guidance documents from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, Bureau of Special Education to guide schools and families on COVID-related issues. So those key principles in IDEA, and probably the one that we're most familiar with that is now included in any legislation that has to do with disability, is that disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of the individual to participate in and contribute to society. And that parents are entitled to be informed decision makers. Really important, and something we'll go through as the session goes on. Children with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. We refer to this as least restrictive environment, LRE. And then supplementary aids and services must be considered and provided to support learning and participation in gen ed classrooms and extracurricular activities. Next slide, Heather. So this is just a real general picture of special education and the process. We start with an initial evaluation, which is then drives the evaluation report. And that report also lets us know about the eligibility of the child for special education. The team then goes on to develop the IEP. And at the next part, not that it's missing, this is more about the evaluation, but the next part would be placement. Only after we develop the IEP can the IEP team talk about placement. It doesn't go anywhere else in that process. It's the last thing we talk about because we have to know what a placement is going to be appropriate to provide what we've developed in the IEP. And then subsequent to that is reevaluation. So COVID-19 updates. We mentioned before OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, that's our federal special education. And the guidance that we've got from them, it's been general, but it's been helpful in the state coming up with their own guidance. What's most important regarding OSEP guidance is that nothing has changed. There are no changes to what we've expected all along, what we expect from special education all along. There's no changes in any timelines. There's no changes in any of the entitlements that students have. Nothing's changed. Timeline's not changed. Child find is not changed. So child find, when the district has the responsibility to identify, locate, and evaluate any child with that might have special needs or need special education, that is not waived. So evaluations cannot be waived. Reevaluations cannot be waived. These are still responsibilities of the school. I see I put some things in chat. So one of the things that we'll be going through, some of the handouts that I'll talk about, they're going to be one of those. They're going to be, in the chat is explanation about one-on-one support during remote learning. This was a pretty hot topic when we would talk to parents at the PEAL Center. Kids are still entitled to what's in the IEP. Teams might have got together to talk about differences in being at home versus being in a classroom, but the placement of the child in the program hasn't changed, just where it's being delivered. So if there's one-on-one that was needed in that classroom and the student still needs it, then the team's going to have to talk about that and how it's going to be provided to the student at home, whether it's remote or through a decision made by the team, if the child's going to have one-on-one support in the home. There's information from the Bureau of Special Education in Pennsylvania about evaluation and reevaluation. Mostly the fact that there's no changes. This school is still responsible for those. And there may be some times when certain testing has to be in person, but that doesn't mean that a report can't be issued with what was found by the school and in terms of eligibility. And again, remembering that there's still child find in place. There's still the obligation of the school to identify, locate, and evaluate a child for special education. So even though we don't have all the information, it's going to be important that the team take a really close look at what they do have so that they're not in non-compliance about not having a child be identified when they really do need it. And there is information about COVID compensatory services. Similar to, not identifying a child when they should have been, some of our kids have not received services that would be a free, appropriate public education that every child with an IEP is entitled to. And in those cases, and it's not, again, this isn't the fault of the school, it's due to COVID, that things haven't been able to be provided the way they were when children were in the buildings. So the state has issued guidance on these compensatory or makeup services, and there is a formula, not, kind of not black and white, but a formula that is used using data to come up with, for the team to help the team come up with what's going to make the student, give them that information or the instruction they need to be where they would be if there was no COVID. Not easy, but it's there. So I mentioned before that all parents have the right to be an informed decision maker. And this is really important for parents. And when you're advocating for your child, something really important to remember, because you should have the information that you need as a member of that IEP team, as an equal partner of that IEP team, have the information you need to make informed decisions. So if you need information from the school regarding your child's disability specifically, regarding how they're teaching him or how he learns, you're entitled to all that information. You're entitled to be as informed as anybody else at that table. So while you're making those decisions or thinking about things you want to talk about at an IEP meeting, you want to consider your child's entire school day, from the time they step on the bus to the time they step off of the bus, and what needs do they have at certain times of day. I'd like to really emphasize the importance of extracurricular activities for our kids. And even in this time of COVID, there's some extracurricular activities that are going on, and what kind of support your child would need. My own son was in the marching band. He got one-on-one support in the marching band, and he got support so that he was able to do what all the other kids were doing, which included away games, and which included band trips to Indianapolis, to, where else did he go? Indiana, Kentucky, Florida. So depending on what the child needs, that's written into the IEP, don't forget that they're entitled to those extracurricular activities. That's a really important part and a really important social part of a child's school experience. And know the different parts of the IEP and where you as parents can provide your input. There's a section that's just for parent input. You don't want to leave that blank. Take some time, think about, what are your real concerns about your child's learning? What do you want them to learn in school? And again, this isn't always about reading and writing and arithmetic. Social components are really important to a child's day. The school environment is unlike anything that they're going to experience in their life any other time. So use that experience while they're there to help develop those social skills and coping behaviors, things that they need to be a member of society and out there getting a job. Okay, ready for those COVID-19 updates. Here we go. Individual Education Program, IEP. So a good IEP is going to begin with a good evaluation. The evaluation is going to be multidisciplinary, so it's not just one thing. When we do an evaluation, we're looking at a suspected disability. So it's not like a child has to have a document from a doctor that says, this is what this child's labeled as. No, we're looking at what's suspected for this child. And then the testing that's done is going to have to be based on that suspected disability. So if we suspect that a child has a learning disability and the parent suspects that it's dyslexia, let's do testing that's going to show if it is or is not dyslexia based on the information that we can gather. So multidisciplinary, we're looking at input and perspectives from a variety of professionals. The general education teachers, special education teachers, speech language, OT, depending on what this suspected disability is going to drive all the disciplines that we want to get information from to write a good report. Concerns that are expressed when a child is being evaluated are going to drive those types of assessments. So let's get all that information and then develop an IEP with all that good information. So moving on to demographics and dates. This is the first part of the IEP. I have included a link to the annotated IEP from the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, that's PATN. If you have a chance to explore that website, so PATN is the Technical Assistance Branch of the Pennsylvania Department of Education. It's really helpful, not a hard site to navigate, not as hard as Pennsylvania Department of Ed's, and it's really helpful for families because this is the technical assistance that's provided to schools. So if you want to know what they're learning, take a look at the trainings that are being offered on PATN's website. You have access to those trainings. A lot of them now are, recorded webinars. They come with PowerPoints, and explore there the things that you need to know about your child. So demographics and dates. We have a quiz. If we were in person, I'd be giving you a little quiz right now, but you can think about these things as we go through them. The IEP meeting must occur no less than how many times per calendar year? So if you said 1, you're correct. How often can the IEP be reopened in a calendar year? That's up to you and the school. You as a parent can call a meeting at any time, and that meeting does have to be held. Some of the documents, the FAQs that I included in the chat tell us that there's no changes in having IEP meetings. They can be held virtually, it can be held over the phone, whatever works for the family. And when you call, as a parent, when you write, and I would write, a note or letter, email to the school asking for a meeting, there's an expectation that that meeting is going to be held. You need to have that meeting for a reason. And can the IEP be revised without a meeting? It's not a trick question. The answer is yes, it can be revised without a meeting. You, the parent, along with somebody from the school, most times you're talking to a teacher, can agree to something. So this isn't going to be something where you need to have a long conversation, but let's say the child needs books at home. You can talk to the teacher. The teacher will go back to the local education agency rep, which is usually a principal, special ed director, find out if that's all okay with the school, and then they'll just note it on an amendment part of the IEP. So yes, a meeting can be held without, or a revision can happen, they'll call it an amendment, can happen without a meeting, but there does have to be agreement on both sides. Now talking about the signature page, think about this question. Does a signature mean attendance or agreement at the meeting? I've been to meetings where families don't want to sign the attendance page because they're afraid that that means that they're agreeing to something, but it's not. It simply means that you've been in attendance at the meeting. You're there. Regarding COVID guidance at this part, for meetings that are being held virtually, what the state is guiding us in is saying that they would like us to indicate on the signature line the manner in which the IEP team members participated. So was it remote? Was it via the phone? Were there some members that were face-to-face? They just want us to note how that happened. And there are some required members of the IEP team. So if we go to the next slide, Heather, IEP team members. Now, the first four folks on this slide are mandated members. The parent must be there. Regular education teacher must be there. Special education teacher must be there. Local education agency representative. This is a school or school district representative. I delineate between the two because school district would refer to the district. A school might mean a charter school. Or an approved private school. So, you know, saying school, we cover everything, including charter schools. But we need somebody at that meeting that can make financial decisions for the school district. And that's the purpose of having the LEA there. So if you're unsure in a meeting, you might want to say, who's the LEA? Who is representing the school here? Because without that person, decisions that are being made might not happen. That we need that person there to be able to say, yes, go ahead, we could go through with that. And again, that's non-compliance then if that person isn't there. So if you are, you know, if the child is in an APS and there are no regular education teachers, then we would expect that you know, for that reason, there is no regular education teacher or gen ed teacher, and we'll only have a special education teacher there. Person who can interpret evaluation results. So usually we want, you know, if we're talking about an evaluation, we want someone who has expertise in doing that, school psychologist, someone like that. Others with knowledge or expertise. The interesting part of this is whoever brings that person, that other person, whether it be the school or the parent, they're the ones that decide if on the knowledge or expertise of the person they're bringing with them. So if a parent wants to bring, you know, their next door neighbor for support, or, you know, a parent mentor, somebody they're familiar with who they know knows the law, then based on what this parent's saying, that person does have knowledge and expertise on the child and can attend the meeting with the family, and they have that right. So there's no one in the school or the LEA that can say, no, you can't come to this meeting. It's up to the parent. In the same way, if the school wants to bring someone, we would want to ensure that they were familiar with the child, familiar with the IEP, and that they were there because they have knowledge or expertise. When it's appropriate, bring the student. My son was in 5th grade when he started attending his IEP meetings, just to get, you know, an idea of that these meetings were for him. They were about him, and in some ways, getting his input. He'd prepare ahead of time, so he had little, you know, index cards where he'd participate. He wouldn't participate the whole time when he first started out. That can be a long meeting, so he would participate as appropriate. And by the time, you know, he was in high school getting ready for transition, he was kind of calling the shots. Participation of any of those top 4 members that are mandated can be waived with parental consent, as long as the parent agrees. In that case, we would assume then that that person was going to provide a written report so that they would have information to help guide the team in whatever they were talking about. Next slide, we talk about special considerations. So these are special considerations. Everything that's checked here needs to be accounted for in the IEP. There has to be some support within the IEP around any of these considerations. So around blind and visually impaired, we would want to see, are there any, for COVID specifically, are there any barriers to learning when, let's say, the personal protective equipment, PPE, is being used? And this would go too for, you know, children who are deaf or hard of hearing, that's something you'd want to consider putting into the IEP at this point regarding COVID. Is there something that keeps them from being able to participate or benefit from classroom instruction because of what has to be in place regarding COVID? Communication is another special consideration. And let's think about or consider how service requirements will be met. Regarding teletherapy, does a child need teletherapy? Do we have to put that in the IEP because it wasn't there before? Assistive technology, the team needs to consider if the student has access to assistive technology that's needed in the educational environments, whether they're remote, a hybrid plan that a lot of schools are using now, or in person, and then include that in the IEP. Limited English proficiency. What the team needs to talk about here or think about is how the ESL program is going to be delivered, whether it's in a full in-person, whether it's the hybrid learning model or full remote. You have to think about that, and some things are probably going to have to change because of the way that, that schools are delivering their instruction right now. Behavior. IEP team needs to discuss how behavior or blended learning environments have impacted the students' behavior. And this still has to be a consideration, whether the kids are at home. Again, their programs haven't changed. The programs that the children are getting remains. The place where we're being delivered the instruction has changed. The place, the location has changed, but not the program. So we have to consider regarding behavior, are there additional materials? Is there a schedule that needs to be made up for the child? Just what does that child need in that environment? And regarding COVID specifically, are there any special considerations that are associated with COVID-19 and the mitigation members that might need to be included in the IEP? So next slide, if any of these areas are checked, then we're going to want to put that information in the present ed levels of achievement and functional performance so that these can be addressed throughout the IEP. Now moving to the next slide, present levels. So this part of the IEP, we'll talk about both functional and academic levels of performance. And this doesn't necessarily refer to grades. You might see grades listed in that part, but we're talking about actual achievement of the student. That's why a lot of times, grades, while they could be subjective. A lot of kids get points for bringing in Kleenex, or maybe they get points if they bring in their own face mask. But what's the actual achievement of the child? That's what we want to know, and that's what usually we get through assessment. So that is contained in this part of the IEP. And functional performance, behavior, daily living skills, things like that. At age 14, we're going to include transition assessments. Now it's age 14 according to the law, but if an IEP team determines that the child is going to begin transition planning earlier, that's up to that team. But at age 14, we're going to start including transition assessments in the IEP and listing those present ed levels regarding transition. All the needs in this part of the IEP have to be addressed in other sections of the IEP. So, if there's a need for some specially designed instruction, some accommodation that has to be provided for the child, it will be indicated here, and then it'll be listed in the specially designed instruction part of the IEP that we'll go over in a little bit. And again, as I mentioned earlier, parental concerns. I see probably too many IEPs that don't list any parental concerns, but this is your place as a parent to be able to say, you know what, this is really bothering me. I'm really, this really concerns me that his social skills aren't progressing, and that, he continues to not speak up in class, or that his reading is falling further and further behind. Any concerns you have, and these parts, they can't be edited, or they can't be censored. reasonably. So whatever your concerns are as a parent, use this part to indicate that. It could be something that, Peter Wright from wrightslaw.com always tells us to prepare as if we're going to due process at all times. So if there's a concern that you have as a parent that you don't think's been addressed, this is where you'd want to put that concern. So in preparing for something, we can go back and say, well, look, I was concerned about this a long time ago. So use it for, what it's used for. If a parent wants to write up something ahead of time to be able to deliver to the IEP team, feel free to do that. It's easier for the team then to just go ahead and put that information into the IEP. Regarding COVID-19 guidance, what the IEP team should consider is practices such as distance instruction, teletherapy, or teleintervention meetings that are held on digital platforms, and online options for data tracking, documentation. And the state kind of guides us to thinking about low-tech strategies that can provide for an exchange of curriculum-based resources, instructional packets, projects, written assignments, things like that. And again, this is all written in the annotated IEP. So that link that's there, and what the state's done that's been really helpful is anything that has to do specifically with COVID is highlighted on the document that you would download. So when we're thinking about these present ed levels, and parents thinking about what are my concerns, think about your child's whole school day from traveling to school, before school begins, that opportunity for social skills that happens right about then, academic classes, related service, lunch and recess, which my understanding is looks very different now, traveling throughout the building, homework and organization. We're getting some calls about the kids' organizational skills and how it was working when they were in school because there were supports in place, but now that they're at home, it might not look the same. Talking about those extracurricular activities, and even preparing, when my son was in 4th grade, which is when a lot of kids start thinking about playing an instrument. We thought ahead to high school and what a great opportunity that would be for inclusive education if he was in the marching band. So that planning had to start in 4th grade when kids start playing instruments. So think about those things. And then again, traveling home. Is there situations on the bus? Are you comfortable with the bus? Is there another way that the child would need transportation? All things to think about. And, quickly again, present levels of academic achievement, functional performance, talking about transition, students' strengths and needs. If a need is identified, it has to be delivered somewhere in that IEP. There is a lot on COVID guidance about functional performance and academic performance, and that would be really helpful probably for parents to look over before an IEP meeting. Transition services, next slide. This is such a big topic, such a hot topic, and this is kind of, it has evolved and is now changing a lot when we think about those transition to adult services. The 3 areas that are addressed in an IEP include post-secondary education and training, what that's going to look like, employment, very hot topic, and community participation, independent living. So the things that we look at this part of the IEP are outcomes, general. What do we want to see post 21 or post the child leaving? What activities are going to be done to support that one of those areas? And then what IEP goals are going to be included in the IEP to ensure that the child can have those outcomes. The COVID guidance that's included in transition is that the team should consider how transition services will be delivered remotely and or in a blended learning environment. As hard as it might be to imagine some transition services being offered remotely, we have had some changes. There's been some, struggles in trying to get that in place, but we are seeing that there is, job coaching and learning experience, work-based learning experiences, other experiences that are being delivered in that way and helping a child. Don't forget, though, that, what we're calling COVID compensatory services, which is actually another training all in and of itself, can be provided, especially for students who are in transition, and especially for students who might have aged out or, turned 21 during that time when buildings were all closed from last March until maybe even currently. Real quickly, participation in state and local assessments. There have been no change. There was no obligation last year for states to do like PSSAs and Keystones, but there is no waiver this year. This year, students are expected to take those tests. Schools are expected to deliver them. The guidance that comes to us from the annotated IEP is that the team should consider documenting adjustments to assessments based on state or federal guidance. And here's some resource information regarding guidelines for accommodations that can be provided and criteria for PASA. PASA is given when an IEP team decides that the child's needs regarding assessments can't be identified, or their learning levels can't be identified using the PSSA. Pennsylvania alternate system of assessment, PASA, is used, and teams will decide that on their own. So there's some criteria there. The next slide, goals and objectives. This part's so important and often not understood by families at all. And often not, by some people who are actually writing the goals. There's a direct relationship here to the levels of performance. You want to refer back to that, back to evaluations and assessments that were done on the child and see where are those needs. And that's what we're going to translate then into a goal. We have to have short-term objectives if the student participates in taking the PASA. And reporting progress is huge. This is the only way that we as parents know what's going on, is what is in place now working for our child. We only know by looking at that data. So if you're not getting progress reports in a way you understand them, then you might want to go back to your IEP team or to the teacher and say, can you tell me what this really means? Sometimes it's so tempting to write, child's progressing, but we have no idea what that means. And if some kind of a graph, they have all the data they need. So all you have to do is take that data, plug it in. You know how easy it is to make a graph from that data. So let's see that. Let's see, what do those up and downs, what do they look like? Is it a trending line? Are we going up? Are we making progress? Or is it a straight line or going down? We're not really seeing progress. That's going to help us a lot. On the next slide, we talk more about those goals and objectives. They have to be measurable. They have to be observable. We have to know, what will the student be able to do? How well will the student be able to determine it? How are we going to determine mastery? So if the student does the goal one time, we can't really say that that's mastery. They've done it, but can they do it every time up to after that to show us that they have indeed mastered the goal? So that's what we're going to we want that in the measurement. And how frequently will it be probed or evaluated? On most IEPs that I read, this part is what's missing. So families, how often will that probe happen? What we want to look for in progress monitoring is instruction, then a probe. Did that instruction work? Then instruction, then a probe. Again, did that intervention work? We can also see if that intervention did not work, that probe's going to tell us that. And in that case, look then at what changes are we going to make? And then how it will be measured. again, something we should get really deep into. But anybody has any questions, you know where to find me. So program modifications and specially designed instruction. Here's your definition for specially designed instruction: adapting as appropriate the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of a student. At age 14, this is going to include transition. So the students should get the support that they need to be included with their same age peers. And this is what we're going to look at as a team. The IEP team is going to take a look at this as a whole and during the entire school day, as far as how are we going to best ensure that this child is included with their same age peers throughout the school day. And only when those needs can't be met or provided for does the team take a look at anything that's less than that least restrictive environment. The COVID guidance here tells us we should look at existing program modifications and SDI. So what's in the IEP prior to COVID in March? What did the IEP look like pre-COVID? To make a determination to which are appropriate in meeting the students' needs in a blended or remote environment. Think about how those needs are going to be changed or what it might look like. And again, that we need to consider that need for one-on-one. If the student's in remote learning at home, that doesn't mean that the need for one-on-one support has gone away. Children are entitled to a free, appropriate public education, which means it's not necessarily mom or a caretaker that should be providing that service when it's needed by the child in order to learn. So on the next slide, we talk a little more about specially designed instruction and considering the needs of a student in remote or hybrid settings. In the next slide, how a student will access the gen ed curriculum, not whether they're going to access it, but how are they going to access it. It's assumed that every student will have access to the gen ed curriculum, whether they're in their neighborhood school, whether they're in an approved private school or another private school that the IEP team has determined is appropriate for the student. Every student should have access to gen ed curriculum. And that doesn't mean that it has to be at grade level or it has to look exactly like the kid who's sitting next to him who's in the gifted program. No, they have to have access to the gen ed curriculum. It's based on what are their needs. Talking again about extracurricular, I can't emphasize that enough and how important that is to our students. When you think back about, when you were in school, it's not that great science class necessarily or that fantastic geography class or geometry. That was worse. No, that's not what you think about. You think about the homecoming parades, you think about prom, you think about school plays. That's what really is important to a lot of kids and to our kids with disabilities too. Related services. These are things like speech, OT, PT, occupational therapy, physical therapy. So the IEP team for COVID guidance has to provide related services and determine how those related services are going to happen for a child via remote or hybrid learning. So the team needs to note in the location column how that's going to be provided. And that's an important thing to remember. And, when then the team is talking about the child coming back to the building, that may need to change again. There is information on the link from the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, FAQs, that talks about that one-on-one support. And this next slide on related services gives a not exhaustive list of related services. One that's especially important and will likely be important this school year as we talk about the transitions that kids are going through between, going back to school and then buildings closing because of COVID outbreaks and then going back home, is psychological counseling as a related service. Know that that's available to kids, know that that's available in the school or needed, or where it's needed, where the child's learning. Those psychological services, again, this is done through an evaluation to find out what the exact needs of the child are, but that psychological counseling as a related service is available to kids during the school day. Supports for school personnel. This is a big one. Aren't they all really, though? Supports for school personnel is when a teacher or, let's say, a paraprofessional needs more information about maybe a child's specific disability, and there's maybe some reading material that a parent's aware of, or maybe some training that's occurring. And this is where we can note some training or information that'll be important for that school personnel to know. If a parent has something specific, maybe they can, present it at the IEP team, especially maybe for those more low incident disabilities. They can share it at the IEP team, and to ensure that the school staff is going to take a look at it, let's just put it in the IEP under supports for school personnel. The COVID guidance regarding supports for school personnel talks about professional staff and paraprofessionals getting the information in remote or blended learning environments and related to the environments that we're learning in. If they need information on the platforms that are being used, or how to best help a student in the platforms that are being used, or for curricular materials or instructional strategies at these times when learning looks a little different, that can go in there also and should probably be considered. Again, we're talking about school supports for school personnel on the next slide. Trainings, consultation, maybe from the intermediate unit if needed, a defined time for teachers and paras to meet, or teachers, special education teachers, gen ed teachers, to meet at a common planning time. That's really important for an inclusive education. Going to the next slide then, regarding extended school year. The important thing to keep in mind here regarding COVID is that extended school year is going to be very different and not the same thing as COVID compensatory services. It's possible that a child next year is going to go to school the whole summer, or could have an opportunity to go the whole summer, if we're talking about COVID compensatory services being offered then, and then extended school year. So this is something parents are really going to have to pay attention to, that the COVID compensatory services don't supplant anything in the general education. It can't be offered during the school day because it's supposed to be on top of what a child needs. Same with extended school year. It's not in place of extended school year. It's something completely different. So as far as COVID guidance, that's one thing we'd want to take time to think about. And again, ESY, nothing has changed regarding ESY, and especially for our targeted group, where we want to have eligibility determinations for the targeted group. So, looking at children in certain disability categories, children with more severe needs, this determination has to be made by the end of February. A NORAP, Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, has to be issued by March 31, and the various ways that ESY can be offered, whether it's through academics, therapies, or socialization. Let's finish up with the end parts of the IEP educational placement. This is where we're going to talk about, the specially designed instruction, and have we talked about everything regarding specially designed instruction to ensure that the child's in their least restrictive environment. We've highlighted here guidance around placement, because just because we have COVID or remote learning in place does not mean that placement has changed. This is placement in a program, not placement about a location. So educational placement changes should only be considered after we're looking at recruitment strategies, which right now You know, you'll see it on the compensatory services, COVID compensatory services guide that tells us these first 3 months of school should really be concentrating on recoupment strategies, recoupment services for our kids. We're going to take these 3 months, schools should be taking these 3 months to talk about recouping those skills that have been lost probably since March. And then the team's going to think about what supplementary aids and services are going to be appropriate for remote or blended learning. And again, that's going to might include one-on-one. Again, you know, these things shouldn't really change. Or next slide, Heather. Amount, type, and location of support shouldn't necessarily change. When we talk about amount of support from special education personnel, that's when it's being delivered by special education teacher. It doesn't mean when a para is with a child in a gen ed class. A gen ed classroom is general education. That's least restrictive environment. And lastly, PennData, this is the information that's reported to the state, which the state then uses to report to the feds. This is the amount of time that a student's with non-disabled peers. So again, only when a student is in special education, in a special education classroom with special education teacher. Otherwise, if the student has a paraprofessional, is in a gen ed classroom, they are with typical peers, and that's not included in special education when we talk about the amount of time that a child's in there. So we talked about those underlying principles. Disability is a natural part of the human experience. Talked about COVID guidance. I feel in some ways we kind of glossed over it, but those resource documents are going to give you a lot more insight into the guidance that is being provided by the Pennsylvania Department of Ed. And it does seem a bit vague, but in Pennsylvania, we have local control where the school districts have control over most, if not all, these decisions. So that's why it sounds like it might be vague. And we looked at different parts of the IEP and where and how parents provide input and become informed decision makers. Here's all our contact info. And again, if there's anything that you guys need or you want to call and ask questions, we're available. Heather?
So I will make sure that those resources that you mentioned get sent out to everyone so they have easy access to them. And the slides will also be sent out as well. So everyone should have access to all of the resources that Cindy talked about today. I'm opening it up for any questions. It looks like we have time for about 1 or 2 questions.
Sure.
While I wait for any additional ones, I'll ask a general question. I'm sure PEAL has been receiving a lot of questions and concerns lately with the switch to remote learning and kind of the uncertainty of what will happen these next few months because no one really has definite answers. So if you could kind of distill it into, 1 or 2 big picture best practice tips for parents who are navigating this process, what would that be?
I think number 1 is keep those lines of communication open. If there's concerns you have regarding the education of your child, don't wait, call the school. At the same time, phone calling is so easy and you get those, immediate answers you might be looking for, but it's also important to keep documentation of things that might be important or things that you may need to use at a later time. So I would consider putting those things in writing too. But communication is so needed right now. We need to keep that open. And the other thing, and we've actually heard it from, the Bureau of Special Education, is that parent training is so needed right now. So if you have an idea for parent training for your school district, I wouldn't be afraid to speak up and request that training for a group of parents, parents and teachers. That's really needed right now too.
That is excellent advice. I think we are just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up by thanking you so much for that wealth of information.
Thanks,
And
Heather.
I really do encourage anyone with questions to reach out to PEAL, as they are really great experts on this and can really help you navigate what I know can be a very confusing system if you're not really used to it. And adding COVID on top of that only serves to cause more confusion. So we are very lucky to have such an excellent resource here in Pittsburgh. And thank you all so much for joining us. Our information is here on this slide. We really love to hear from you. And if you have any suggestions about topics that you would like to hear in the future, please let us know. We love all of your suggestions. And that is it. Thank you all so much for joining us today.